The night Dahlia Fontaine lost the silver rose, she didn't cry. She stood in the doorway of the saloon she'd built with 8 years of her own hands and watched Cornelius Vane's men nail his notice to the door, and she made herself a promise that she would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. Not there. Not in front of the whole town of Copperfield, who'd gathered to watch the richest man in the territory take the last thing a woman like her was allowed to own. Vine didn't come himself for the nailing. Men like him never did the dirty work. He sent his foreman, a thick-necked man named Galt, who read the notice aloud with obvious relish. The saloon was forfeit against a debt Dahlia had never actually owed, a debt manufactured from falsified ledgers and a judge who belonged to Vane the same way his horses did. She'd fought it in the only courtroom Copperfield had, and she'd lost before she'd even finished speaking, because everyone in that room understood who signed the judge's second paycheck. By morning, she was standing in the street with a single trunk of belongings, watching Vane's men repaint the sign above the door she'd once painted herself. That was when Jesse Marrow rode into town. He wasn't looking for trouble. He'd come to Copperfield for supplies and a night's rest, nothing more. A drifter with a tired horse and a quiet reputation that followed him from town to town like smoke. A man who'd once worn a badge somewhere out east before the job had cost him more than he was willing to keep paying. He noticed the woman sitting on a trunk in the middle of the street with the particular stillness of someone who had run out of places to put her anger. And he noticed the way the townsfolk hurried past her like her misfortune might be contagious. He didn't ask her story right away. He simply sat down on the trunk beside her, uninvited, and asked if she'd had breakfast. It was such a small, ordinary question that it cracked something open in her that 3 sleepless nights of fury hadn't managed to touch. And before she understood what she was doing, she was telling him everything: the falsified ledgers, the bought judge, the 8 years of scraping together a life only to have it taken by a man who'd never once had to work for anything in his own. Jesse listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked only one question: did she want it back? Or did she want to be done with Copperfield entirely? She wanted it back. Not for the money? For the principle of it, for every woman Vane had ever crushed under the weight of his name. For the version of herself who'd arrived in this town with nothing and built something anyway. Jesse didn't promise her miracles. He wasn't a gunslinger looking to settle things with a showdown at high noon. And he told her plainly that men like Vane didn't fall to bullets. They fell to better evidence than the lies they told. So they built a case the way Dahlia had built her saloon, piece by piece, in rooms nobody was watching. Jesse remembered enough of his old trade to know where corrupt men hid their sins. And he spent 2 weeks quietly earning the trust of a bookkeeper Vane had cheated out of a promised partnership, a man who still kept a second set of ledgers out of spite, tucked beneath a floorboard in his own home. What they found was worse than falsified debts. Vane had been skimming from the mining company that half the town worked for, paying men in scrip worth less than the paper it was printed on while pocketing the difference. And the judge who'd stolen Dahlia's saloon had been paid from those very skimmings. It was the kind of proof that didn't need a gun to be dangerous. Vane found out, of course. Men like him always had ears everywhere. He sent Galt and 3 others to the boarding house where Jesse and Dahlia had been working through the ledgers, meaning to end the matter the old-fashioned way, with fists and fear. But Jesse had spent years learning to read a room before trouble arrived in it, and he'd already moved the real evidence to the one place in Copperfield Vane's money couldn't touch, the territorial marshal's office 2 towns over, delivered that morning by a rider Jesse trusted with his life. Galt's men found only an empty room and a note that told them exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. The marshal arrived 4 days later with a warrant that named Cornelius Vane in ink, too official to argue with, and the town that had once hurried past Dahlia's misfortune now gathered in that same street to watch the richest man in the territory led away in handcuffs, his empire of manufactured debts and stolen wages collapsing as quickly as it had been built. The judge resigned before he could be dragged out beside him. The silver rose, along with every deed Vane had stolen through his rigged courtroom, was returned to its rightful owners within the month. Dahlia stood in the doorway of her saloon again, this time with the sign repainted in her own hand, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in years, the particular relief of watching a wrong made right. She asked Jesse to stay. Not out of debt, though she owed him more than she could ever repay, but because somewhere in those 2 weeks of quiet, careful work, she'd come to understand that his stillness wasn't emptiness. It was the calm of a man who'd simply decided that some fights were worth having even when they cost him everything. He didn't answer right away. Men like Jesse rarely did, but he stayed through that winter, and the one after, and eventually Copperfield stopped thinking of him as a drifter passing through and started thinking of him as the man who'd helped rebuild what a woman had lost. Dahlia never forgot the morning she sat on her own trunk in the middle of a street that had turned its back on her, certain the world owed her nothing more than its indifference. What she learned instead was that justice rarely arrives with thunder. Sometimes it arrives quietly on a tired horse and simply refuses to ride on by.